They begin to feel an unfamiliar sense of loss they weren't prepared for, and this feeling often creeps in quietly, catching them off guard in moments when they least expect it. An avoidant usually thrives on distance, priding themselves on their independence and emotional self-sufficiency. But when the anxious partner finally stops trying, the avoidant is left standing in an emotional void they never anticipated. At first, they may pretend nothing has changed, telling themselves they prefer the space. Yet the absence of familiar contact starts to feel like something has been removed from their daily rhythm. The check-ins, the texts, the emotional reassurance that once felt overwhelming suddenly become something they subconsciously miss, and they find themselves wondering why the silence feels heavier than the noise ever did. This dissonance unsettles them, as they are not used to recognizing emotional loss, and their mind struggles to make sense of it while their heart quietly aches in ways they have no words for. As days pass without the anxious person reaching out, the avoidant begins noticing small gaps in their emotional landscape that weren't there before, moments of stillness that feel hollow instead of peaceful. They start scanning their memories, recalling conversations, laughter, even arguments, trying to piece together how things shifted so abruptly. And this rumination pulls them deeper into the realization that something meaningful has slipped away. Because avoidants are wired to downplay emotional needs, they don't have a natural framework to process what they're feeling, so this sense of loss appears strange and foreign to them. They may distract themselves with work, hobbies, or other connections, but none of it lands with the same emotional resonance, and this contrast only amplifies the void left behind. It's as if the anxious person carried the emotional heartbeat of the relationship, and once it's gone, the avoidant is left in silence that feels unnatural, almost haunting. This unfamiliar loss also begins to clash with their self-image as someone who doesn't rely on others, which creates an internal tension they try to suppress but can't fully ignore. They may catch themselves reaching for their phone instinctively, hoping for a message that isn't there, or they may feel a sudden pang when they see something that reminds them of the anxious person, realizing they want to share the moment but can't. These micro moments build up quietly, like tiny cracks forming beneath a calm surface, and the avoidant starts sensing that something inside them is shifting. It's not just the person they miss, it's the emotional anchor that person represented, the consistent presence that made them feel wanted even when they acted indifferent. Without that presence, they're left with a hollow kind of freedom that doesn't feel as liberating as they once imagined. And this realization stirs a confusing cocktail of emotions they don't yet understand. As the loss deepens, the avoidant begins feeling the emotional weight of their own detachment, almost like they are grieving something they never thought they would value. They remember how easily they dismissed affectionate gestures or turned away from emotional closeness, and now those moments replay in their mind like missed opportunities. They wonder if the anxious person truly moved on, or if this is just temporary, and that uncertainty creates an ache they don't know how to soothe. The world feels a bit duller. Interactions with others feel less engaging, and there's an underlying restlessness that seems to follow them everywhere they go. It's not dramatic on the surface, but internally it feels like something vital has slipped through their fingers without them noticing until it was gone. This quiet sadness becomes a constant background noise, soft yet persistent, lingering no matter how much they try to push it away or drown it out. Over time, this unfamiliar loss begins to take on a shape, almost like a shadow they can't escape, and it starts forcing them to acknowledge feelings they've avoided for so long. They begin to see that their distance may have cost them more than they expected, and even though they try to rationalize that everything is fine, their heart doesn't align with the story their mind is telling. They may feel emotionally disoriented, like the ground beneath them isn't as steady as it once was, and the certainty they once felt in their independence now feels fragile. Every silence from the anxious person becomes louder, more pronounced, echoing in ways that stir a longing they can't explain. And while they may not act on these feelings yet, the avoidant finds themselves haunted by the absence, pulled into the strange and unsettling realization that they are missing someone they thought they didn't need. And that realization begins to quietly reshape everything they believed about themselves and what they are capable of feeling. Their ego feels threatened, and they secretly crave validation again. And this shift often arrives masked as irritation or confusion before it reveals itself for what it truly is. An avoidant is accustomed to feeling in control, to believing they hold the power dynamic because they are the ones who withdraw when things feel too intense. But when the anxious person stops seeking their attention, that sense of power begins to crumble. At first, they may scoff internally, convincing themselves they never needed that validation anyway. Yet beneath that surface narrative lies a growing discomfort they can't explain. They are used to being pursued, used to being the one who sets the emotional distance, and when that pattern abruptly breaks, it feels like a personal rejection, even though they once claimed they wanted space. The ego, which quietly thrived on being desired, suddenly feels starved, and the avoidant begins to question their worth in a way they rarely allow themselves to do. As days pass without the anxious partner chasing, the avoidant's mind starts searching for proof that they are still wanted. But with no new evidence to feed their ego, a subtle panic takes root. They might scroll through old messages, reread compliments, or mentally replay moments when they felt admired, trying to rekindle that lost sense of importance. The lack of fresh validation becomes louder each day, echoing through their self-image like an unwelcome whisper that they are no longer special to someone who once made them feel central. This contradiction unsettles them deeply because they built part of their identity around being unbothered. Yet the silence is beginning to bother them more than they are willing to admit. They feel an unfamiliar urge to be noticed again, to feel that comforting reassurance that someone sees them, and this need exposes how much their ego had depended on being desired even when they acted indifferent. The threat to their ego also makes them hyper-aware of how others are treating them, and they may start comparing the attention they get from other people with the lack of attention from the anxious person. Suddenly, compliments from coworkers or casual friends feel fleeting, insufficient, as though none of it carries the same weight as the validation they lost. This comparison creates a subtle resentment toward the anxious person for withholding what once came so freely, yet also a strange admiration that the anxious had the strength to stop giving it. That shift in power dynamic bruises the avoidant's pride, making them feel small in a way they are not used to, and their internal dialogue becomes filled with questions about why they were left behind. It's not just about missing affection, it's about missing the mirror that once reflected their significance back to them, a mirror that now stands empty. As their ego strains to recover, they may unconsciously attempt to provoke attention, dropping hints or creating small opportunities to be noticed again, often without admitting to themselves why they are doing it. They might post more on social media, subtly showcase achievements, or even mention shared memories indirectly to mutual connections, hoping word might reach the anxious person. Each action is an attempt to restore their lost sense of value, yet each lack of response cuts deeper, confirming the uncomfortable idea that they no longer hold the same place in someone else's mind. The ego, which once seemed impenetrable, begins showing cracks, and through those cracks spills an ache that feels both humiliating and raw. This quiet desperation contrasts sharply with the composed image they try to project, and the gap between how they appear and how they feel inside becomes harder to maintain. Over time, this craving for validation begins reshaping the way they see themselves, and the avoidant, who once felt certain of their independence, starts questioning how much of their self-worth was built on the anxious person's attention. They start noticing how much their confidence fluctuates depending on external affirmation, something they always believed they were immune to. The sudden absence of praise reveals how fragile their ego really is, how it relied on the steady drip of admiration to stay inflated, and this realization leaves them feeling exposed. They wonder if the anxious person still thinks about them, if they are being replaced, and these thoughts sting not because of love, but because of pride. Each day without recognition becomes another small blow to their ego, and the once self-assured avoidant quietly becomes someone who longs to feel significant again, even if they can't admit it out loud to themselves or anyone else. They start idealizing the anxious partner they once pushed away, and this shift often sneaks up on them gradually as the absence begins to distort their memories into something softer, more romantic, more perfect than it ever truly was. When the anxious person was present and actively reaching out, the avoidant felt smothered, overwhelmed by the emotional closeness and constant bids for connection. But now that space has replaced the warmth, their mind begins painting the past with nostalgia. They replay old moments not as they were, but as they wish they had appreciated them, amplifying the sweetness while muting the conflicts, turning once annoying gestures into signs of rare devotion. This mental rewriting becomes a way to soothe the growing discomfort of their loss, a method to fill the void with something beautiful enough to justify why it hurts so much now that it's gone. The more they remember, the more they reshape those memories, polishing the rough edges until the anxious person begins to glow in their mind like something precious they foolishly discarded. As they sink deeper into this idealization, small and ordinary details start becoming symbols of something larger, and they cling to them as proof that what they had was special. A laugh, a glance, a reassuring text that once felt like too much now feels like a rare treasure, and they replay it over and over to keep that emotional warmth alive. The human mind tends to romanticize what is no longer accessible, and for someone avoidant, this effect becomes even stronger because they are not used to allowing emotional vulnerability in the present, only in hindsight when it feels safe. They start convincing themselves that the anxious person understood them better than anyone ever has, even if they spent most of the relationship resisting that closeness, and this belief grows until it overshadows the actual reality they once experienced. They forget the tension, the fear of enmeshment, the constant need for distance, and instead focus on the moments that made them feel seen, chosen, and deeply wanted. This selective memory becomes addictive because it briefly eases the guilt of having pushed someone away who was willing to give them everything. The idealization also feeds their longing, making them more aware of the absence than ever before, and they begin to imagine how things could have been different if they had handled it better. They fantasize about reaching out and being welcomed back warmly, picturing scenarios where the anxious person smiles and forgives them, where everything picks up as if no damage was ever done. These imagined reunions offer them emotional relief, a way to soothe the regret without actually confronting it in reality, and they start using these fantasies like emotional comfort blankets. But with each passing day, the contrast between their imagined version of the anxious person and the real silence they're getting becomes sharper, which only intensifies the idealization. The mind resists letting go completely because holding on to a perfect memory hurts less than facing the possibility that the anxious person may have stopped caring altogether. As this process deepens, they begin seeing the anxious person as the missing piece that could make them whole, even though they once believed they didn't need anyone to complete them. This inversion of perspective unsettles them because it challenges their self-concept as someone who thrives in independence, and yet they can't stop the flood of warm associations attached to that one person. They start imagining that no one else will ever understand them in the same way. No one else will show that level of devotion, and this scarcity mindset magnifies their sense of loss. The anxious person becomes a symbol of safety, love, and emotional certainty, all the things they secretly craved but could not accept when it was being offered. Now, with the offer withdrawn, they begin to value it in exaggerated ways, turning the anxious partner from a flawed human into a near mythical figure in their emotional world. This internal pedestal makes it even harder to move on, trapping them between pride and longing, between who they thought they were and who they now fear they might actually be. Over time, this idealization starts to color the way they view every new connection, making others feel dull and incomplete in comparison, which reinforces their belief that they lost something irreplaceable. No new interaction seems to spark the same emotional resonance. No new person feels as warm, and this contrast pushes them even deeper into their fantasies of what they once had. They may find themselves silently comparing others to the anxious person, finding flaws more easily, dismissing potential closeness because it doesn't match the glowing image they've built in their mind. This keeps them emotionally stuck, unable to fully invest elsewhere because part of them is still chasing the idealized version of what they lost. And while they might never admit it to anyone, this internal pedestal they've built becomes both their comfort and their cage, holding them captive in a memory that keeps growing more perfect the longer it stays out of reach. Anxiety and confusion creep in as their control begins to fade, and this shift shakes the very foundation of how an avoidant usually navigates relationships and emotions. They are used to being the one who sets the tempo, the one who decides when to come close and when to pull away, but when the anxious person stops pursuing them, the entire dynamic flips in a way that feels disorienting. That familiar sense of emotional safety they get from controlling distance begins to dissolve, and what replaces it is a murky uncertainty they don't know how to manage. They start overthinking small details they never used to notice, wondering what each silence means, and this mental spiral slowly chips away at their calm exterior. The predictability they relied on vanishes, and in its place grows a constant hum of unease, a restlessness that follows them through their day and keeps their thoughts circling in quiet panic. This creeping anxiety makes them hyper-attuned to any subtle sign from the anxious person, scanning for clues that they might still care, but the lack of feedback only deepens their confusion. Every unanswered message, every moment of silence stretches longer in their mind, and they begin questioning if they misread the entire connection from the start. Their self-assured confidence wavers as doubt seeps in, and they start second-guessing not only the other person's feelings, but also their own. They may catch themselves wondering why they even care now, why they suddenly feel uneasy about losing someone they were once so eager to keep at arm's length, and this contradiction unsettles them. The mind that once felt in control of detachment now feels like it's spinning, grasping for something solid to hold on to but finding nothing steady. Each day that passes without contact feeds the uncertainty, and they start to sense that the power they once took for granted has quietly slipped away. As their control fades, the anxiety builds momentum, spilling into parts of their life that have nothing to do with the relationship, yet still carry its weight. They may feel distracted at work, restless around friends, unable to fully engage in anything because their mind keeps drifting back to what went wrong. This mental disarray is foreign to them because they are used to compartmentalizing emotions, and the fact that they can't push this away makes them feel even more out of control. They try to logic their way out of the anxiety, telling themselves it doesn't matter, but their emotions refuse to obey, and that internal tug of war exhausts them. The confident mask they wear to the world begins to feel heavier, harder to maintain, and they notice themselves growing irritable or withdrawn without knowing how to explain why. Their internal world becomes a tangle of fear, longing, and pride, and the more they try to untangle it, the tighter it wraps around them. Confusion becomes their constant companion, and it starts blurring their sense of what they actually feel, leaving them unsure if they want the anxious person back or just want the sense of control restored. They question whether their feelings are real or simply a reaction to being ignored, and this uncertainty keeps them stuck in limbo. Every scenario plays out in their mind on repeat, one where the anxious person returns, one where they never do, and both outcomes feel equally overwhelming in different ways. This relentless loop of what-ifs keeps them from making any decisive move, and the longer it goes on, the more powerless they feel. Their old strategies of distancing themselves no longer work because distance is no longer something they are choosing. It has been chosen for them, and that difference shifts their emotional balance entirely. They feel like they are standing on shifting ground, unable to find their footing, and this disorientation leaves them quietly unraveling behind the composed image they show to others. Over time, the fading control forces them to confront emotions they've spent years avoiding, and that confrontation fuels the anxiety even more because they don't have the tools to handle it. They realize they can't dictate the outcome anymore. can't pull strings from behind the curtain the way they used to, and this loss of control feels almost like losing part of their identity. The calm detachment that once protected them now feels like a cage they can't break out of, because while it shields them from vulnerability, it also keeps them from doing anything that could bring relief. They stand caught between fear of reaching out and fear of being forgotten, paralyzed by the thought of making the wrong move. And that paralysis feeds the very anxiety they are trying to escape. The quiet certainty they used to carry is replaced with a loud, buzzing confusion that never fully leaves, and they move through their days haunted by the sense that everything slipped from their hands before they even realized they were holding it. They become hyper-aware of their own feelings and fear missing out, and this awareness arrives like a sudden flood after years of drought, overwhelming them with emotions they once believed they were immune to. When the anxious person stops seeking their attention, the avoidant is left alone with a silence that reflects everything they tried to bury. And without the distraction of constant pursuit, they start noticing emotions they had long numbed. At first, this emotional awareness feels like an uncomfortable itch they want to shake off, but the longer they sit in it, the louder it becomes, and they begin realizing how disconnected they have been from their own inner world. Memories that once seemed irrelevant suddenly carry emotional weight, and they start asking themselves why they pushed away something that clearly mattered more than they were willing to admit. This confrontation with their feelings doesn't bring clarity. It brings chaos, because every emotion they suppressed begins to rise at once, blurring their thoughts and shaking their belief that they are naturally detached. As this emotional awareness grows, so does their fear that they may have made a mistake they can't undo, and this fear begins shaping the way they see everything around them. They start noticing happy couples in public, overhearing laughter that reminds them of what they once had, and each small reminder hits like a quiet echo of what could have been. This fear of missing out becomes sharper as they realize the anxious person may be building a new life without them, possibly giving the same love and energy they once rejected to someone else. They picture moments that used to belong to them now happening with another person. And this thought twists inside their chest, blending jealousy, regret, and longing into something they can barely tolerate. The idea of being replaced becomes more than a fear. It becomes a haunting presence that follows them through their day, coloring their thoughts and tugging at their pride. Even though they once claimed they didn't want closeness, the possibility of losing it forever makes them suddenly aware of how deeply they might have wanted it all along. The awareness of their own feelings also starts to unravel the stories they use to tell themselves about who they are and what they want, and this identity confusion makes the fear even stronger. They used to see themselves as independent, detached, unaffected by emotional bonds, but now they are confronted with evidence that they can feel just as deeply as anyone else, maybe even more intensely because they've kept those feelings locked away. This realization shakes their confidence, making them question how much of their self-image was just a shield to protect them from vulnerability. They begin wondering what else they've missed out on in life by holding back, how many connections they might have sabotaged without ever giving them a chance to grow. This spiral of self-reflection pulls them into a place they've never willingly gone, a place where they have to admit that they are not as invulnerable as they once believed, and that vulnerability makes the fear of missing out burn even hotter. With every passing day, the fear grows heavier because time is moving and they feel like they are standing still, watching something valuable slip away while they remain frozen. They notice how quickly people can move on when they stop being prioritized, and that realization terrifies them because it means the anxious person might truly never come back. This fear creates a sense of urgency that clashes with their natural instinct to withdraw, leaving them stuck between wanting to act and being too afraid to do it. They imagine reaching out only to be met with coldness, and that imagined rejection keeps them silent even as the silence becomes unbearable. Their mind runs endless scenarios of what the anxious person might be doing, who they might be with, and each imagined scene fuels the fear that they are being forgotten. It becomes a loop they can't escape, where the more they think about what they're missing, the more precious it seems, and the more precious it seems, the more afraid they are of having lost it forever. Eventually, this hyper-awareness begins to seep into every part of their life, changing the way they view not only the past, but also the future, and it leaves them feeling emotionally cornered. They start questioning what love means to them, what they actually want from connection. And these questions have no clear answers, only more uncertainty. They find themselves emotionally stuck between who they were and who they might become if they face these feelings honestly. And that limbo becomes exhausting. Every little memory of the anxious person now carries a sharp edge, reminding them of what they might never experience again. And this possibility makes their emotions even harder to ignore. They move through their days carrying an invisible weight, constantly aware that something meaningful could be slipping away while they do nothing to stop it. And this fear of missing out becomes the quiet drumbeat behind every thought, pushing them to finally acknowledge the depth of what they feel, even though it terrifies them to do so.